emergency room, you sat there for 18 hours?
right? Yeah,
It just sounds expensive.
so that was what I told Heidi, my wife. I was like, I told her, and I said, so it's 11. I went in at like 5 o'clock on Friday, and I say it's 11. They said I don't have another room, so I'm just going to see HDR. And I was like, oh, this bill is going to be
Just go to another hospital.
miserable. And it wasn't that bad.
No. Yeah, I would be like, yeah, I'm gonna get it. Now, see you guys later. Take care of this another day.
Nothing. Yeah, just a spare piece of meat.
I bet you should.
All right, 6:30, call the meeting to order. Can we have roll call? I do. Thank you. I need approval on the September 14th, 2023 agenda.
So moved. Support.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Motion carries. We have the minutes in front of you from the regular meeting held on August 10th, 2023.
Make a motion to approve the minutes for the regular meeting held on August 10th, 2023, as presented.
Support. Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. All right, so I'm going to open up public comments. This is the time for the public comments from anyone who wishes to comment on a matter that is not already scheduled for public hearing. Anybody like to address it? All right, hearing none, I'll close public comments. We will move on to the public hearing scheduled for this evening. We have a special land use request from Leah to operate.
I'll take it, go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
I'll take it.
What's the last name?
Layla Abadia.
Layla Al-Fadiyah. To operate a salon at 108 Howard Street. Jason, would you like to present?
Thank you. Good evening, planning commissioners. Again, I'm Jason Ball from Rural Professional Services Company. Again, we have a request from Layla. I'm sorry, we left the L off of Layla's name in the agenda. It's Layla Abadia. The request tonight is to locate a salon in a property that's actually zoned industrial, but it's in our mixed-use zoning district. Just as a reminder, what that mixed-use zoning district does is the underlying zoning stays in place, but then if any other use is requested that's permitted in the zoning district anywhere, it can be brought before by special use. And so the request tonight is to provide a salon in that industrial zone, on that industrial zone parcel consistent with the mixed-use district. So this is the property here on Howard Street. It's an old frame shop. You may be familiar with it. Small parking lot in front, building in the rear, one story, sort of unassuming building. This is the property here. The applicant is not proposing any exterior changes whatsoever. Parking lot's going to stay as it is. Building's going to stay as is. I assume a sign will change at some point. There'll be a separate permit. So the applicant's not requesting any changes, strictly just future interior work to retrofit the space. This is the property here. The hash marks there are mixed-use zoning district, and the gray there is the industrial zone that's applied to it today. Any questions about the request and the status of the property at all? Okay.
What
Yes.
are the adjoining uses on the property?
So this use here to the east is a duplex. And then to the west is a vacant lot. And then further to the west is a sort of U-Haul / general services business. There was a request to repurpose that building into a marijuana facility. At this point in time, I don't believe that use is moving
So I see the for sale sign. Is it like this is hindering the sale of the property? She is the new owner, or is she looking as a tenant?
forward. She'll be the new owner.
The new owner.
I can let her speak more to that, but yes.
Okay.
She does own.
The new owner. Okay. All right. So that's the old sign. You've already bought it. There's just okay. Okay. That's yes. Thank you.
Yes.
So as you're familiar, there are a few standards in our ordinance for approving a special land use. I'll briefly run through those. The first standard is that's compatible and in accordance with the goals and objectives and policies of the City of Brookfield Master Plan. The master plan identifies this area as a mixed-use area, and so in this case, repurposing that building for this use is clearly in compliance with the master Second goal is to report the purpose and intent of the ordinance and the zoning district. So in this case, certainly it doesn't comply with the industrial zoning district that is there, but the mixed use overlay certainly permits the use. The overall permit of the zoning ordinance, there's no risk to public health, safety, or welfare. The salon use is a minimally sort of invasive use. Some traffic during normal business hours, we wouldn't expect any impact on the adjacent uses. The use is constructed, operated, and maintained to be compatible with the existing or intended character of the vicinity, and not to change the essential character of the area in which it's proposed. In this case, there's a very small parking lot there. The applicant's use of the building meets our parking standards, so you're not going to see a lot of traffic. There's just 8 spaces in that parking lot. So we have limited traffic, again, during normal business hours, and so potential impact on adjacent uses is minimal. All the rest of the use happens inside the building. There's no outdoor storage or noise or change to lighting in any way that should impact adjacent uses. The fourth standard that it's served adequately by public facilities, traffic operations, et cetera. Again, Howard Street's not a main street, but we are talking about a pretty minimal use in terms of traffic. The salon use shouldn't generate any significant demand on public services beyond what you'd expect with the existing frame shop there in terms of use of electricity and otherwise. The fifth standard then does not involve uses or activities that in comparison to the uses permitted in the district would be detrimental to the natural environment, public health, safety, or welfare. In this case, the existing use or district is industrial. So the salon use is actually a less intensive use than what's permitted there anyway under the current industrial zone. So special land use to permit this salon actually allows for less intensive use than a more intensive use that's unique. Typically, special land uses are the other way around. So from staff's perspective, this request meets all of our standards for a special land use. It's a fairly straightforward request. Again, we're actually permitting a less intense use on the existing industrial zoning district with this special land use request. Any other questions or concerns from you?
Sure, I have two other questions. So the duplex use that's adjacent, I'm looking at a Google Maps picture of it. I don't see any kind of screening in between the parking lot and the house. Is any screening being provided by a site plan for this use?
They aren't proposing any changes at this point in time, and since the use is essentially consistent with the use that's there today, we felt like requiring that screening wasn't necessary. That's certainly something that's within the planning commission's purview if you'd like to see some screening added.
So a common complaint I've seen for this type of use adjacent to a residential use is, especially in the winter, people will get into their cars, the lights, their headlights will then be right at the house. So traditionally I see a screening of Harbor 5/8 or something up to about 3 foot tall to prevent that from happening.
That's certainly an option there on that parking lot. The parking lot is a little forward from the house, but that's a reasonable request that the planning commission can make as a condition of the approval to have either some landscaping screening there or a simple privacy.
Question, is the duplex also a special use?
I believe it's a pre-existing non-conforming use there. Those properties, the zoning changes from industrial to commercial there, I think, right about those duplexes.
Any other questions? Do you know at this time what your hours might be? Are you gonna be open mostly during the day or will you have some evening
We are
hours?
mostly during the day, but we do have a shift. We do, for women who come off of work and do the after hours, we do have some after hours, not a lot, it's mostly during the day.
Seems to me, car wash is right behind that duplex too. So they're getting in with headlights in every direction. I don't see why if one, then all. So, because, I mean, it's right in the middle of a commercial area, and they're seeing a lot more headlights from behind the house than anyway.
Two wrongs don't make a right.
Just an opinion.
Any more discussion, Commissioner Kelly?
Oh, that's funny. I used to work at that building. That was my first job. Cindy was my first boss. And I work there after hours. I mean, I know that that's a heavy, the alternate properties are heavy use. It's no problem with it.
I was gonna say, I think so too. I think the use going there definitely is a low intense use compared to what could go in there. So to me, it makes sense. I'm looking at your picture you have here. It does look like there's a tree line on that side. Not necessarily that's gonna block any lighting, but it looks like
So, I know the public can't see this, but there are some low bushes over here by the building itself. You know, just from an enforcement perspective, and having done this previously, you can get phone calls from citizens who will say, well, headlights of the business next door coming in my windows. It's such a minor additional cost for this applicant to put in some screening, low-level plants, 4-foot wall, something. And yes, I get that it's an intense area, I get that there's others running uses where they're gonna need more headlights, but, yeah, they're the ones in front of us today.
all right. So any more discussion? Anyone want to make a motion either way?
If you wanted to hear from the applicant as well, I can.
Yeah, we'll give you a minute. Do you have anything?
Open the public hearing.
For her, okay. Well, open the public hearing, you can address the
He did such a good job. I was worried I would have to talk more. I don't know if I'm supposed to be up here or not. But I'm 32 years old. I've been living up here for 22 years. And I've had that my salon in downtown up here for like 8 years now. So everything he said, this is just a more permanent location for us instead of renting. That was that. But yeah, as far as like what Jason said, we wouldn't be changing anything besides changing the floor and painting the walls. There would be nothing major, very minor cosmetic. I do have brush. This what we offer? Does that matter at all? We're not a hair salon, so we don't need plumbing or anything like that. We do lash extensions, some facial, and some waxing. So it's just mainly the lighting. We don't need to add any plumbing or anything like that. We're not a hair salon.
Yeah, you can piss those out.
Yeah, we did do hair 2 years ago, so I crossed that off. She no longer works there. I'm sorry, I only got 5. They're gonna have to have extra. But we are no longer doing hair, so it's just lighting is what's necessary. We don't want lash extensions.
Jeff, you can have one.
Just
All right, well, thank you. All right, we'll close the public hearing portion. Any more discussion? I think this seems to me that this is a nice addition to downtown. I have something from you. Congratulations on that, so. Commissioner Kelly?
Madam Chair, I would like to make a motion. That's okay. Or are we still?
Go ahead.
Only background, probably not say the name or anything.
So,
I'll make a motion to approve the special land use requested by Leah. And to allow the salon to be located at 108 Howard Street, parcel ID number L21-44-800-040-00 because it meets all standards in section 7-19.04.
Support.
Thank you. Any more discussion?
I know it's such a minor thing, but I can't support it unless we modify that screen.
Commissioner Hanson?
Is that something you'd consider modifying your motion?
I
to
don't,
include-
All right. Well, we got a motion on the table. Is there any more discussion? All those in favor of the motion as it is? Aye. Anybody opposed?
No.
Thank you. Motion carries. All right, so we're gonna move on to, thank you again. Thank you. And we're gonna move on to the amendment to section 7-15.05.D to a lighting standards to remove the restrictions on required types of lighting fixtures. Jason?
Thank you. So we spoke about this last month. This is a very straightforward amendment. We're removing a reference in this section to high-pressure metal halide lights. In your packet, there's also another reference in that section to metal halide that we'd be removing, just to be agnostic to the type of light. So if it's LED or something we don't even know about yet, it's going to be really great if it comes along in 10 years. We aren't requiring that change. We're just providing that option to be any kind of lighting. Continue to enforce our same foot candle standards requirements for downward facing and shielded lighting, but removing the standard from metal halide because those lights aren't in use. This was just something that I think in the past staff hadn't been enforcing. I think it was an oversight when the overall zoning ordinance update took place last year. And so we got an application recently from an applicant who noted, hey, I can't comply with this because we're all LED now. And so we wanted to bring this to you.
Thank you. Any discussion or questions on that for Jason? All right.
I will spare you all of the zoning ordinance amendment standards on this one since it is very straightforward unless you all would like me to run through them.
I think I'm good. We can have it after. All right, so we have a motion.
You have to open and close technically.
Oh, why am I just, I'm new at this. All right, so we open the public hearing portion. Jeff? No? All right, so I'll close the public hearing. Any more discussion? Commissioner Patterson.
I make a motion to recommend approval of the proposed text amendment related to lighting standards as presented to the city commission because it meets all standards in section 7-23.06.
Support. Gerald.
No? Thank you. Any more discussion? All those in favor? Anybody opposed? Motion carries. So we'll move on to the amendment to Article 16 to add standards for electric vehicle charging stations and related equipment.
Thank you. So obviously this one's a little more complex than the last text amendment. So as we discussed last time, we talked about in general the need for amendments to the ordinance to provide for electric vehicle charging because today electric vehicle chargers are permitted via our accessory use standards. And accessory use requires it to be located in the rear yard. And so beyond just allowing for electric vehicle chargers to be in the front yard, we've provided some standards here for your consideration. So in your packet, there is language in there that is in green. And that language was trying to provide some of the options we talked about last time on that spectrum between, incentivizing or requiring electric vehicle charging stations in certain situations. So I will walk through that draft, but before I got into it, I just want to see if anybody had any initial sort of overall thoughts, questions, concerns before we kind of go through the information.
I think it was pretty straightforward what I read. As you go through it, maybe I'll.
Okay. So,
The green areas didn't really show up good in the packet, so you might.
okay, they should show up
What's
well.
optional.
They should show up well on here.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Kim and I went back and forth on what color. We picked green, so we thought it would work really well, and we won't do green.
Blue.
I don't know, pick something else. The first page just provides a variety of definitions. So we need these definitions in order to allow for the rest of the ordinance to work. So these definitions would be added to our definitions chapter. And so we have definitions for an electric vehicle in general, or a plug-in electric vehicle, excuse me. The key difference there is some hybrid vehicles can technically be an electric vehicle. And so in this case, we're regulating the version that actually plugs into something. We don't have an interest if your electric vehicle charges itself, or there's some mechanism for that to happen. Like a lot of hybrid cars do. There's a gas version and an electric version. They don't actually plug in. Definition of charging, the definition for a charging space, and that definition for a charging station. And so the reason for the difference there is you can have a space, and then the station may not be with that space. So a lot of times there's one station, two spaces on either side of the charging station. And so we just need to differentiate those two things. And then we have, these are in green, I apologize, it's really hard to see. Electric vehicle capable and electric vehicle ready. We talked about these definitions a little bit last time. Capable means that in essence, in the electrical box, there's a circuit for creating an electric vehicle charger somewhere down the road, but none of the actual underground infrastructure has been installed. Electric vehicle ready means that the underground infrastructure, the conduit's been installed. There's a junction box there underground to actually install the electric vehicle charger, but the charger doesn't exist. And so those are definitions that they're green because they're optional. We may keep those, we may not, depending if we want to require some sites to be established that way in the future. We don't have to, but those are options. And so I'll talk more about kind of how that functions in the next page. Any questions on definitions?
I guess maybe you're gonna get into this, but I'm thinking, why would you have electric vehicle being capable of the, but it's not functioning? Is that just because, like, just initially, but then eventually won't hook it up? Or is as we develop something, we put it there and then down the line if there's a need?
It's to the cost of creating that space in that electrical box when you're building a building is a lot cheaper than retrofitting it. And so if we're ensuring that that space is there down the road, if the need arises, it's much easier to run that line, not electrician, to make that connection than if we have to start over with adding a new electrical box with a higher amperage and everything else that requires.
And this isn't a requirement that we would have on, like, all, or it's coming down the line, that any new building or new structure would have to have this, correct?
There are some options. We could remove both of those definitions from the ordinance and not do that at all. But we talked about sort of giving those options to let you all kind of consider it tonight. So that's what they're doing.
All right.
So the next is use standards. So defining, where in our zoning ordinance, there are a lot of tables that define what uses you can undertake in different zoning districts. So this is showing kind of where electric vehicle charging happens relative to those districts. So in residential districts, electric vehicle charging stations are a permitted accessory use within single-family residential districts if the station is contained entirely within a building. In your garage, permitted use, we don't need to know about it, get your electrical permit. If the station is located outside of a building, it must meet standards for accessory structures in a residential zoning district. So they need a zoning permit from our building. They're going to have to come to see you, so they still need that zoning permit. And that should say section 7-13-10, not just 13-10. This on the next, for our commercial, industrial, and multifamily zoning districts, charging stations are permitted accessory use in any off-street parking area. However, the charging stations are subject to the standards listed in this section, not accessory use standards in that accessory use section. So we're in residential, not in a front yard if it's not inside the building, right? So we don't want the charging station in somebody's front yard. Commercial, industrial, multifamily, we're not subjecting it to the same accessory use standards. It has its own standards that are then assigned here in the rest of this section. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay.
But you're saying that would be allowed up
Correct. Not in residential districts.
front, which is in the other districts.
Right. The reason for that is some people don't have a garage, right? So you may not have a good location to do that, so you may actually install some sort of small charging pedestal. You can do that inside your house, in the rear of your house. We don't want it to sort of standalone pedestal to be in the front yard, just like we put in a satellite dish sitting in somebody's front yard. Or a pole barn or something else. So it's required to be, the face of the house or that.
So and that's for, remind me, just so I'm clear, so that's not considered multifamily, we're not saying that.
Correct.
Right, any residential is one standard, this is just commercial and industrial.
Correct.
No. But these have been approved with multi-family.
Well, that's not my,
Single family.
So in single-family residential zoning districts, so our R1 through R3 are defined as single-family residential zoning districts in our ordinance. They're grouped together.
okay,
So in those districts, the charging station can't be located in the front yard. In all of our other zoning districts, it could be located in the front yard. So our RM1, RM2 are multifamily zoning districts. We're regulating it by district, not by use.
see, I would think to me, multifamily, when you have a home, it's a home right downtown, it's a multifamily use, that, obviously our hope is for the city, we'd love to see CRDB turn back into single family, but to me, I feel like that would fall more into residential, is what I would think, rather than commercial and industrial, because it's still in your neighborhood, it could be right next door. Personally, that's how I feel about that. I think it could be right next door to a single family home, if you have all these stations up front, to me, I feel like that would fall more in residential.
Yeah, that's a fair concern. The issue there is so much of our existing multifamily has parking lots in the front. There's a parking lot between the building and the building's not in the front yard. There's a parking lot between the two. And so that's where those charging stations are going to go. And so that would really prohibit them from being able to install them in those multifamily developments.
Don't we have just regular homes, I mean, there's several single family homes downtown that are just split into multi and just have two.
But he's doing it by district, not use.
Yep, so I'm doing it by, hang on, let me
There's
That's what it is.
Completely different, yeah. So it's zoned.
It's
Okay.
zoning,
Never
not
mind,
the use.
that changes everything.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I'm just thinking if looking at just a multifamily, no matter what district it was in.
So in all of the, tan and light gray colors here, I'm sorry, tan and brown colors, the Rs, no front yard. So in our areas, north of the city, in our small sort of traditional single-family neighborhoods, as well as our more suburban single-family neighborhoods, not in a front yard. But in our RM1 districts, or, but our RM1 districts where we have condominiums, multifamily housing, so much of those, the parking is in the front already, and most of this is going to be a retrofit anyway. So
You did point out the zones. I think I just wasn't grabbing that.
You're in good company. Being sure we're talking about zone versus use is tricky because there are multifamily uses today, and some of those are R1 or R2 districts. They're small, but those would not be permitted to be in a front yard because again, we want to keep it consistent with that neighborhood.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And so we have this one is electric vehicle charging as a primary use. This came up a little bit last time. It is in green. And so this is dealing with if the primary use of a parcel is the retail sale of electric for charging electric vehicles. So this isn't really a thing right now. I don't know that it's ever going to be a thing, but imagine somewhere down the road we have, instead of gas stations, we have electric vehicle charging stations with a convenience store or whatever else. And so this is essentially saying that if that use happens, it's subject to the same standards as the gas station. And so the definition there is that if more than 50% of the parking spaces are designated as electric vehicle charging stations, it's as a primary use, and that would be subject to the same standards as a gas station. So that's something that we can include as an option, or we can just not have it at all because it's unlikely to be an issue. When it does become an issue, we can address it then. The only reason to not have it at all is because by the time we get to that point, my suspicion is the world around electric vehicle charging is going to look really different than it does today. And so there may be some benefit to when that use comes around to being able to say, wait a minute, we need to develop new standards for this versus putting it under the standard that we came up today that applies to gas stations that might not be appropriate. But I can't tell you now as your planner what that's going to look like.
Makes sense. We need to, my first thought is let's be proactive and have it there, but the way you've presented, that makes more sense too. Why put something there that I'm not sure how it's supposed to look anyway.
Yeah,
But it can be changed.
absolutely.
I think it's definitely something.
Is everybody good with sort of keeping that in for now? Again, an unlikely use to be honest, but this is sort of the simplest way to provide for it today with some strong standards. We have really good standards today around regulating gas stations and fueling stations that I think would ensure that we don't have any significant traffic impacts or off-site impacts from something like that. But again, I don't know what that's going to look like right now because we're just not there yet.
So is it just as easy to change it as it is to add it, or do we open ourselves up for?
It is just as easy to change it as it is to add it. The only risk we run into is that someone comes in and submits an application under that language, and if it's inappropriate, we're stuck with that language. But that is a small risk.
I'm vote to not put it there right now. That's kind of my thing. Let's leave it off then and address it when we can, so we have full control over it.
What's everybody else?
But you want to leave it there?
So the purpose of having standards for a gasoline, whatever station, is to accommodate the fact that we're dealing with vehicles, right? You got ingress, egress, you got a screening to manage, the headlights at night, you got to have the overhead lights during the night, et cetera, et cetera. If we're talking about charging electric cars, electric cars are not going to be that different, from gasoline cars. You would think that we'd want to have almost the same, if not identical, rules and requirements. This is kind of 50-50. On one hand, if you don't have anything in the ordinance, we'll just have to say, sorry, we don't allow that here. And then we're gonna be kind of stuck in the same position that we're now. We're like, well, we gotta rush through an ordinance because we don't have that as part of our, versus if we put this in there, yeah, things might change and somebody might not like the language in the future, but at least we have something, something that matches with our current requirements and standards.
Possibly have something, for business owners to go by as well.
I'm good with majority, I'm 50-50 on both pros and cons to it, like you said, I could see it, I don't think it's like a pull one way or another definite, so I guess what's the majority guys thinking?
It's engineer on this, let's see what reason, let's see anything that's happened there. More evident there, so.
Yeah, I agree. So,
I'd rather recognize that the problem could exist by having the ordinance,
we can
Rather
if we need
than-
to.
put the blinders on.
Okay,
Okay,
that makes sense.
that's what you thought too, right, so. All right, let's leave it, I guess.
So then the next section relates to those kind of incentives versus requirements that we talked a little bit about last time. Zoom in on this. And so these kind of go from less of a requirement to more requirement as you go down from A to C. So the first one there is electric vehicle charging station is included in the calculation for minimum required parking spaces. So we count an electric vehicle charging station just like we would any other regular parking space. The next there is that the minimum number of parking spaces required may be reduced by one space for each electric vehicle charging space provided, up to a maximum reduction of 10% of the required spaces. And so that's a very simple incentive, right? So parking spaces are expensive, you have to maintain them. And so if I have a parking lot of 20 spaces and I add 2 electric vehicle charging spaces, I now only have to have 18 spaces. So very sort of simple, easy incentive. The next one down then is more of a requirement. And again, these are all options. You can do some of these, none of these. You can kind of pick and choose here. Any new parking lot proposed as part of an application for site plan review or special land use with more than 100 parking spaces must provide at least one electric vehicle ready charging space per 50 parking spaces. So again, this is conduits in the ground. Or a new parking lot proposed as part of an application for site plan review must install electric vehicle charging stations on a minimum of 2% of the parking spaces. So same requirement, we're requiring actual installation instead of just a ready space where conduits in the ground that hasn't been installed. And certainly there's points in between those two that we can require other things. We could alter the sort of threshold there of 100 parking spaces to have it be less or more. But generally what you're looking at there is a large development where people are likely to be there and staying there for a period of time, where you're more likely to have this need or opportunity for electric vehicle charging. We're either encouraging the infrastructure to be there or requiring the actual installation of charging stations. Ann Arbor is not surprisingly sort of on the leading edge of this in Michigan, right? Ann Arbor's updated their entire parking standards so that every use has a percentage of parking spaces that are required to be either EV ready, EV installed, or EV capable. And so every use has a requirement for some sort of EV charging, whether it's any use, industrial, commercial, regardless of how many parking spaces are allocated to use this. My assumption is we probably don't want to go there.
And when we're talking existing use even, or they got requirements.
This is all new
on this
use.
standard or just all new use?
All new uses, correct. So come in for site plan review, or you're going in to get a zoning permit to install a new development, you have to provide some sort of mechanism for EV charging.
Would you say capable is kind of defined as having pipe ready?
Yeah, so capable is the electric panels ready. And ready is the pipe, that conduit's in the ground, but there's no actual charging station. So I want to put that charging
Ready
station in, it's a matter of
less.
connecting it to the jump engine box.
So ready is pipe and capable is.
Yes, capable is the higher, ready is a higher standard than capable. I recognize that that's kind of confusing, but these are the sort of going terms right now.
Ready to go and feasibility.
Yeah. And so again, the difference here is option A is optional. We're not requiring anybody to do it, but there's an incentive. If you do install electric vehicle charging stations, that you get a reduction in parking spaces, which is a reduction in cost for your development.
I think my opinion on A is, I think no matter what, even if we were to require it or not, but for it to not take away from, if you need 50 spaces, if you have 5 charging, that it still counts towards your 50. I mean, I think that just makes sense no matter what requirement we put on it.
And so that's settled for number, so that's what number 1 does, that's not in green, is that a charging space is included with your calculation.
Okay, so that's
it's a 1-to-1.
standard. Okay.
Right, we aren't making you install more spaces because you installed an electric vehicle space.
Mr. Ball, is capable, is it possible to do both A and either B or C?
Absolutely.
Because I see Madam Chair's point that, not requiring them to do something is obviously business friendly. We're incentivizing, we're not requiring. But, as far as I can tell, this is the future. And we don't just look out for businesses here, we look out for the citizens here. And so also including B or C, I think would tend to look out for the future use of the citizens as well.
I guess what I will say too is we don't get many requests for developments with 100 parking spaces. So part of that too, maybe thinking about whether, that number is, Kimmy knows better than I do. I'm trying to think of requests that I've seen. So Blaine's Farm and Feed would be a recent one where they would have had to install some charging spaces. And that's one that honestly would make a ton of sense because it's right off the highway. That's a use there that people aren't generally popping in and out of. They're going to be there for a while. That's one that makes a lot of sense.
Could you change the language on that to be less than 50 spots require 1 charging?
Absolutely, it's an arbitrary standard. We can make it 72. It's good to pick a number that's sort of a round number, right? That's not totally arbitrary, but there's no clear rubric on at what point you have demand or don't have demand.
Because I think it may not be as important right now, but in 5 years from now, we might be singing a different tune. We have businesses that are ready as they're coming in as new construction. I think it's an incentive for people to come to repair and we're getting out in front of it, right? So instead of being behind the curve, I think this is not going to stop, in my opinion. So I just wonder if that 100, 25, 50, I don't know what the right number is, but just.
Well, don't we already have 2 businesses looking to install today?
We do, and those are going to be retrofits, and I think the vast majority of these that we will see will be retrofits. And those are car dealerships for obvious reasons, right? They're going to be selling more electric vehicles, so they want to have that infrastructure there.
I thought one was a grocery store.
And Kroger.
Oh, you're right, Kroger.
Honestly, anybody can add it to we have standards that they have to follow, but we need to focus on. 100, so really that's Meyer, Blaine's, that would have been
The
Meyer.
only thing on our current list that it would apply to is Blaine's, but then I don't know about industrial, that depends on your number of employees.
So what if, how many requirements or requests do we have that's 50, that's up to 50?
In our
That's still a
current
big
development
parking lot.
report, the only one is Blaine's, and the only one that might other two would be the urgent industrial, but that's all employee.
Yeah.
And I don't think security has another one on the books now, the security federal.
I
And
can't
security
imagine.
credit union, I don't think that has, it may have 50.
I can't imagine it'd be over 50. But
There's a lot on that back parcel.
Okay. I guess the other thing I would offer too is that we could include, so is your preference for requiring them to be ready, meaning the pipes in the ground, over requiring installation? Is that a fair assumption, or would we rather require actual installation?
I think, in my opinion, actual installation, because this is one of those things where when you think about a larger business that comes into town, do we want a brick Walmart or do we want a aluminum siding Walmart? Well, we want a brick Walmart. So this is the same type thing to me. I think it's a requirement. These big box, and I work for a large company, you make it part of the requirement. We're not talking about Lash. We're talking about corporations. So to me, it's a no-brainer.
So The only thing I'm struggling with, because I agree, it's a future, it's a minor cost of a huge corporation, is I could foresee a big business where people don't spend a lot of time there. I go to Menards or something, I'm in and out in 10 or 15 minutes. And these level 2 chargers, what I'm guessing most of these would be, you know, for an electric car, you might get 2% charge or something in that time. Should we be requiring it for these huge corporations if you're in and out 15 minutes? I mean, I'm just struggling with that part of it.
I guess the other option would be that we could write in a waiver language where it's a requirement, but, you know, the planning commission can waive that requirement if the applicant demonstrates that, you know, the use of their parcel isn't appropriate for electric vehicle charging stations or something. You know, if they can make the case, look, the average time somebody's parked here is 25 minutes. This isn't a use that's going to really lend itself to this. Then as a planning commission, you could grant that waiver.
But that'd be pretty much everything, though. Lanes, Meyer, it would be everything. I mean, what is going to have 100 spaces? I mean, and there may be, the majority of the things that come in, that requires 100 spaces is going to be something that people aren't going to have.
Well, plus and I think what you're doing there is you're interpreting how long someone's gonna be in the store. I don't know that any of us can predict that. I guess what I'm saying is, as a requirement for a city trying to move forward, I think it's good to have charging stations where we can. And who better to ask to do that than a larger company,
Sure.
right? So, I mean, I'm not gonna fall on the sword for this one. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. So,
So my next thing is if we're saying that 100 spaces, but let's say if we went with B, you need an electric, ready charging space per 50 parking spot. So should we require someone who comes in that has just 50 to still put one? Wouldn't that be the same? I mean, if you're gonna require 2 for 100, but our requirement's 50, wouldn't it?
So there's almost never a world where you install one because the pedestal goes between two parking spaces and it feeds two cars. Does that make sense? So that's why we did per 50.
Okay. Because really they installed one, but it covers for the requirement.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's not universally true. So like the Tesla superchargers are kind of a one-to-one, but a lot of the non-Tesla ones that exist right now are a post that goes between two parking spaces with essentially two charging ports on either side of the post. So again, we have options here. I guess my suggestion, based on hearing what you all have to say, would be, we could go down maybe at 50 spaces. We require it to be, let me get this wrong, ready but not capable. And at 100, we require it to be installed. So 50 spaces, we require you to put the conduit in the ground. We're not requiring you to install it. And at 100 spaces, you have to actually provide for 2 EV charging stations at a minimum. And that kind of splits the baby.
yeah, maybe you covered this, but okay, so you've got the conduit, you got everything built, you don't have the charging station. How is that enforced? Is that left up to the business owner, or?
Essentially, we're making the leap that they've already spent the money and it's there in the ground. So at the point in time where suddenly it makes sense to do it, it's really easy to do it now. The hard part's been done in terms of running the infrastructure. So that's the rationale there, right? Versus requiring it to be all the way installed. So we wouldn't be able to come down the road and say, okay, it's 2027 now, you have to put that in. But we're making the assumption that business would want to do it at that point in time because it's a positive thing for their customers and they've already spent, 75% of the cost on that.
All right, so I want some clarification, just maybe. So capable is the box, not the underground.
Correct.
Ready is the underground, not the thing, so really none of it's ready. Because what if someone puts the underground and then that's our requirement, they never wanted to put the rest of that box there, what's the sense? I mean, there's no enforcement after that.
Well,
no one
that's what I
has
was
to.
doing.
Yeah, so to me, none of it's ready, it's just, you do a little bit more this way, but even then, capable, you put a box without the rest of it. So we could have a bunch of boxes for the entirety of its, existence with a box or underground, but never really have a charging station.
You absolutely could. And the reason for that is because we're at this early stage of adoption with electric vehicles, right? And so communities are a little hesitant to require folks to install charging stations that may sit empty.
Yeah.
that's, and we're in a funny place with this, right? Like I said, one thing I can tell you with absolute confidence is however this works today will be very different 5 years from now, right? I mean, I'm sure of that, and 10 or 15 years from now, it'll be even more different. And the other thing I'll just add too is that, based on what I've heard most recently, at least 80% of electric vehicle charging is gonna happen at home. In your garage, in your driveway, parked in front of your condo or apartment. Because, I mean, imagine if you could fill your car up while you were at home now, you would totally do it, right?
Well, they sell it, I don't know whether it's the after, but my sister-in-law has a Tesla, she plugs it into our outlet in my garage.
Right.
So, I don't know that this is maybe gonna be that big of a deal, but I feel like this is something that won't benefit the city of Lapeer right away. But potentially down the road, if we got ahead of it, it's incentive maybe for people that are looking to move to a community that's got more charging stations than another community that does not, so.
The Blaine's development is a great example, right? I mean, anything that occurs around the, 24-69 interchange are things where charging stations make a lot of sense because you've got a lot of traffic there, people aren't off. That's a good location for that kind of stuff.
My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't have an electric car anymore, so I have an interest in having one, but isn't it not necessarily people who just run to Blaine's, the grocery store, need to plug in their car because they probably can home? Isn't it more like when you're traveling, you're looking for places to go?
That's
So like
correct.
you go, oh, okay, Blaine's is here, so it's more gonna be, rather than not the person who ran in for 10 minutes, it's gonna be more somebody's looking for a station.
You're not going to do it for a local trip, right? So, I mean, it's not going to be something where I live in Lapeer, I run to Blaine's to get some mulch, right? It's going to be, I'm traveling on 69, my cars need to charge, I get off, and then I walk around Blaine's and buy some stuff while it's charging.
But if I decide in my electric, which I don't have one yet, but I test drove one this past weekend, and oh my goodness,
It's the future.
I am absolutely gonna buy one soon.
Crazy fast.
If I want to go to Oxford, Lake Orion, wherever, have dinner, I wanna go somewhere where I can plug my car in for 2 hours while eating.
Well, and it's the reason why you see lots of communities considering them in public parking spaces, right? Because it is, if I have to drive my Tesla to get off at 69, I could go walk around in Blaine's or I could walk around in downtown. And
It's an incentive for a business really to say, even if it's not a requirement, I'm putting it in because you are gonna draw people to your restaurant or draw people to your
Right.
business having it. But
I think a lot of people do want electric cars, but more importantly, the charging stations, whether they're traveling or not, just the idea. They've been asking for it here for a long time. So I think it is a very big incentive for businesses to
Well, speaking,
They may wait 3 years, but I think
at
it
least they
is.
have the ability to.
speaking from a company that's a Fortune 100 company, they will not do this unless they are told to do it. So instead of saying Walmart, I'll say Sherwin-Williams. They're not going forward with things like that. We don't have an option to drive an electric vehicle right now. So I think it's important that we put something in place that makes them accountable to do it. What I'm struggling with is what's the right number, because I don't know what's the percentage of electric vehicles out there now? Is it 3%, 2%?
it's low. So right now, the total number is less than 5%. The projection is by 2030 that around, I think it's 25 to 30% of all cars purchased will be electric.
Mhm.
But again, all cars on the road, then about half of all cars purchased will be electric by that time. So again, you're looking at 10 years, you can get to, 10 or 25%. And those numbers are all based on a whole lot of assumptions, right?
And this is something we can change as we go, just like the other verbiage, right?
Right.
As we see more of a need or
Yep.
something that.
So Kim did make a point, and we do have a request that's likely pending for sometime this winter for a large restaurant use on 24, again, sort of near the highway, that would probably trigger that 50 parking space required.
Commissioner Pelletier, do you have that?
Oh, I think it was all coming down to market's gonna play itself out.
Yeah.
So if you're saying, okay, if you're gonna do a development, you need to be ready because you are the market and you want people to come to your place. So now you're the market, so you already know what you're gonna do. So if we're prepping it for ready, not capable, you're prepping your property, you already know you're gonna do it. You all know what's gonna be happening. so the market's gonna play itself out. Well, cool.
I'm sorry, I see a lot of developers who don't have that kind of forward thinking.
Well, we're gonna make them have it.
Well, and that's what I keep getting at. I mean, this is kind of a unique situation here because we're talking about, we're talking about something that's maybe an exciting part of the future. I think the communities that get out in front of this are the ones that are going to be the more desirable communities to live in. Especially people maybe with a higher tax base, which is what we need. So, not that we're going to be hammered about it.
Mr. Ball, so you and I had talked about a different parking ordinance that would shift the requirements that we have now to more like the suggestion. Because my personal belief, it's been a trend I've seen in planning and zoning, that cities are moving away from an actual minimum requirement, but they're allowing the developers to come in and kind of give their piece about how many parking spaces they should have. But it's still, the planning commission would still retain the ability to say, no, you got to put X number in. Would it be possible to put into that ordinance kind of a waiver of this electric car requirement if the business were to come in and say, it's never going to happen here, it doesn't benefit us in any way?
Yeah, I mean, think about what we did with landscaping, right? We just went through this in the last meeting, where we provided some flexibility on landscaping with work sending people to get a variance now. And so Sunoco came in with their site plan, and we signed off on it today to do 50% of the trees on the one side. So we could include that same sort of waiver. That waiver applies to landscaping wholesale, right? I would personally love to apply that waiver also to parking, because most of our parking standards, and I say this as somebody for whom this is his career, are arbitrary and based on standards that nobody can really tell you why it's 300 square feet, not 400 square feet for retail space. And the realities of how we use those spaces are changing so quickly right now that parking space demands are a lot of empty parking lots.
So we can make it a requirement as part of this ordinance, and then a release valve under the other ordinance, which would be directed towards number of parking spaces.
Correct. And we could add a release valve under this ordinance too. If that's, we could allow the planning commission to waive requirements here as well if you wanted to and there's some benefit to that given the unknown unknowns that exist with this, right? There are things that will come up with this that we just don't know about.
Right, so based on that, I say, should we just go step by step? As far as A goes, that obviously makes sense to everybody, correct? Counting that as a space. So then when we go down to looking at B and C, I mean, again, the numbers, we're not really sure, at least it's a starting point, but to me, maybe B with 1 every 50, when it's a requirement of 100, seems to be, again, more of a, seems more logical to me than maybe the percentage, but I guess what was everyone's feeling on that?
Well, just because I want to be sure I'm clear about this now. So when you say 1 for every 50 spots, but you indicated it will actually charge two spots? Right, so
That
that's.
covers their 2.
So if we went down to 50, we would do 2 per 50 spaces.
Yeah. Okay. I was reading it because it says a minimum of 2% on the next line, so actually this is 4%.
Correct. If we went 2 per 50.
I mean, what do we think of 2 per 50? So if you have 100 parking spots, they're required to put 4 in, right? Correct. Is that what's everyone's thoughts on that versus?
In 10 years, when you are driving an electric vehicle.
You need to test what
I have been in a Tesla.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, they're heart stopping. They're definitely a different experience, but I'm good with yes.
Yeah, I'm fine with the 4, what was it, 4 per 100, right? Is that what we-
That would be what the result would
I'm
be.
fine with
So then moving forward, if we keep that in there, then are we just gonna have a requirement that if somebody applies for the 50, then they have to still do the 2?
So, well, I guess, based on what I'm hearing, what I would do is amend B to say that any new parking lot proposed as part of an application for site plan review or special land use with more than 50 parking spaces must provide at least 2 electric vehicle charging spaces per 50 parking spaces.
that. That works for me.
Yeah.
So that'd be the change. So if I ask for 100, I need 4. If I ask for 150, I need 6.
Yeah.
208, and so on and so forth.
Because I think that kind of fits where we are, maybe not, and for the next few years, and this might have to be changed, sooner or later, but for now.
Well, and so again, what we're requiring there is that the space is ready, not installed. So there's a junction box there, it can be installed. I think the push to giving property owners is, all right, I'm gonna spend this money to put the conduit in, I might as well put the charging station in and get some benefit from this, but you're not actually requiring that. So I think anybody who's a little bit savvy is gonna connect those dots and go, well, I might as well get some benefit out of this and go ahead and finish it, but we're not requiring that extra expense if they don't.
I see that.
I would like to address the release valve as part of the other ordinance.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
And please, can you explain exactly again what you mean by release valve?
So again, the standard, as Mr. Ball indicated, these numbers can be a little capricious, a little arbitrary. And I don't know if you guys have been to a mall during Christmas recently, if malls even exist anymore, but there's just acres and acres of parking spaces. They're never filled. Same thing with Meyer, Walmart, and all those. So I'd like to see the city's parking requirement. So it'll say something like, must have one parking space for every 300 feet of proposed floor area. Well, if that equals 800 parking spaces, which will never get used, the ordinance which we discussed is that the planning commission would have the authority to accept evidence that 800 spaces is too much. Usually it would be the developer would come in and say, whoa, 800 is too much. We have the same exact store in the next town over, and they only have 200 parking spaces. You could say, well, 200 spaces makes sense. So then the planning commission could approve with only 200 parking spaces based on the evidence presented by the developer.
Okay, so I have a question with that then. I think that does make perfect sense because if you do see more parking space sometimes in new buildings, that it doesn't even look nice to the community. So, but if we require on the person coming in and building, makes perfect sense. We don't need 800, we need 200. So what happens when that structure sells? Now, and that a whole new use comes in, and it's a commercial use, but now it's an intense use that requires that. Once it's, so then do we just turn down the use because it doesn't have the required parking spots, that even if then they agree that they need 300 now?
So right now
what do we do with that?
It's a good question. So right now we do have a provision in the ordinance for what's called a deferment, which allows you to basically say, I'm not going to build those parking spaces today, but there's space in my lot where I can build them tomorrow if I need to.
So we'd always require them to keep that space?
Well, so right now that deferment exists in the ordinance. I was talking to Kim about it. As far as we know, nobody's ever used it, but it's there. And so it requires that space to be maintained and be there for, I think our ordinance says 6 months or a year, I can't remember what it says, in the time frame basically. And if that time frame passes and it is demonstrated that it's not needed, then it can be converted to something else. To your point, Janelle, but if something changes, so I have a commercial space, I have 50,000 square feet, I only need 200 spaces today, somebody else moves into my space and they need more. That's the issue for that new property owner, do their due diligence and figure out how to solve that problem. So that the reverse in that is what we're requiring today is the current owner to build more parking spaces for the future person who may or may not ever come around. And this is more of a, like Mike mentioned, this is sort of a general recognition amongst the planning profession, particularly since COVID, when all these parking lots were empty. Everybody sort of looked around and said, oof, we don't need this much parking. There's a thread, blog, whatever you call it, for Black Friday parking spaces amongst the sort of nerdy planning folks. People go out and take pictures of parking lots on Black Friday that are empty in the busiest shopping day of the year. And the argument there is, look, we're requiring way too much parking. This is supposed to be the day when this parking we built gets used. And look, it's empty. And that's really valuable commercial real estate, right? Those are lots that can be repurposed for other commercial real estate, multifamily development, whatever, that sit vacant and create lots of runoff and pollution and other issues. So I'll get off my soapbox about it.
No, but I say COVID, I mean, obviously it showed a lot of people, I mean, it just excelled everybody into the future of thinking, like, they don't need that big of a building anymore, the
Right.
overhead when a lot of people work from home or whatever. So I definitely see commercial spaces, even themselves, the buildings, getting less and less, and then obviously parking too. I just am thinking, I think maybe initially where the 300 square feet, 500 square feet rule came up was almost some type of guideline so that we didn't end up, so what I'd also hate is a commercial building to go for sale. They can't ever sell it and be able to vacant building in town because they really have no way to add parking. So I think there's a happy medium with that, but I definitely think our requirements for just a blanket requirement doesn't seem to make the only sense.
And the other option, that, and we can provide some options on this, so the other thing we've done in other communities is we've capped that waiver at a percentage, right? So you can get a waiver from parking up to 25% or 50%, or whatever that waiver is that you're comfortable with maybe the option to go more, but you're kind of putting a cap on that, so you don't have something that changes drastically. And again, that's kind of an interim step, right? Some communities are getting rid of parking minimums wholesale. We're probably not there yet, given the sort of automobile-centric nature of where we live. But that is something that's going on in other places. So I think, looking at that option to give waivers from parking, just like we give for landscaping, makes a lot of sense. It's not, that the idea of waivers isn't foreign to us in its own ordinance, right? We have lots of options for waivers from everything from building facades to landscaping, and we could do the same for parking.
All right, thank you for all that. So we're gonna add in, thinking of adding that to the ordinance as it exists and put this under this section as well. That was your,
No, so I could present Mr. Ball with draft ordinance that would do all the things we just discussed, which would then apply to this, but we'd have to pass the other ordinance separately.
So we're part of the parking chapter as a whole.
So the parking standards would remain. It would still be, you must have one parking space for every 300 square feet, whatever it says, but it creates a rebuttable presumption that that's what's required. And then it's on the developer to come in and say, oh, that's too many parking spaces. They then can convince us, the planning commission, that whatever number they're presenting is better. And then we can just adopt that.
thank you. All right, any more questions or discussion on that, Commissioner Jackson?
Probably a little late. I was wondering on the multifamily, we're getting more multifamily developments with garages. And rather than require charging stations per se, they already have the garage. Could we require a dedicated 220 line into the garage?
So if we stick with the ready standard and the garage had that, it would be good.
That way, if you're ready, if I rent that apartment, I put my charging station in there. The garage is ready for it.
Okay. Or even if it's got a garage, it has to be inside. If it doesn't, then we'll say, right? Then it's
That's what I
outside.
mean. If
then
it's a
it should be
garage,
ready.
require a 220 into the garage.
So in the way we have this worded now, that's a really good example of that. The Carriage Hill development that we just looked at, right? Multifamily with garages. So there's a total of 32 units in there at 2 spaces apiece. That's 64 spaces, which would trigger our 50. So that would mean they'd be required to have 2 places in there that are EV ready. What that does, though, is they say, all right, well, if I have to have 2, what does it take just to make all of these garages ready for an electric vehicle? And why don't I just do that? That's a minimal expense to add a little bit more to the junction box in the garage anyway. So we're not requiring it, we're kind of like tickling the brain a little bit to make them think about it.
Okay, thank you. I think that's, if they think about it, right? I mean, if people aren't that savvy about charging stations or, but I like the idea if it has a garage, it has to be inside, honestly. But if it doesn't, then it's required.
I think the bigger the company, the less you should expect.
Yeah, and then we don't have too much. Okay, all right.
So the third page then, so I guess just to circle back, to close that loop, on item B, number 1, we will keep A, and we'll revise item B to be 50 parking spaces and require 2 EV ready spaces per 50 parking spaces and get rid of C under item B1. Item 2 there under B is just that public electric vehicle charging stations are reserved for parking and charging electric vehicles only. we're allowing electric vehicles to be parked in any other parking space they so need to. When Mike and I talked about this, there is an element of this to enforcement that is a little tricky, because parking is not something that gets enforced via zoning, it gets enforced via police power. And so if the city really wanted to, at some point, enforce that somebody parked their non-electric vehicle charged car in electric vehicle parking station, it's probably an amendment to the city's traffic code. It would just allow that to be taken, just like you can ticket somebody for parking in a parking space. The next section is on design standards. The requirement there for the charger between 36 and 48 inches off the ground is standard in every one of these ordinances. That's for two reasons. One, because you don't want it laying on the ground and creating potential issues if it gets wet. The second is that if you're in a wheelchair, that's an appropriate height to be able to access and plug into it. The rest of the design standard section just requires some sort of protection for the EV charging station, whether it's bollards or a curb, so you can't back your car into it. Make sure that any infrastructure serving the station is underground, not that it's running a wire above ground. Item 5 is one that we will sure deal with right away. So requiring that associated mechanical equipment like transformers may be located within the front yard but must meet all standards of the zoning ordinance. And so those include they have to be screened. So remember the example we showed of the Tesla chargers in Swartz Creek? The transformers that came with that were screened just like we would require. What was the credit union? We just had screened the generator. Dorp Federal installed a generator inside their drive-through. We made them put in some bushes around it, right? So we're requiring that same thing if it's in the front yard or wherever else it's
So, Mr. Ball, I understand this, you understand this, but if you're a developer looking at that, must meet all other standards of the zoning ordinance, why don't we just say must be screened?
We could say must be screened. See section 7-1507 is the one that tells them to do that. So we could say must be screened.
Must meet all standards of the zoning ordinance, including screening or something, just because it's obvious, but
Absolutely.
shouldn't have to force them to go look up the next, ordinance to figure out what's going on.
Absolutely. The next section relates to canopies. Canopies were a thing earlier on in EV charging. They're less of a thing now. They still exist. Canopies, think of drive-through canopies, right? So canopies just to protect the charging station from the rain. So permitting those, but not in the front yard. So you're going to do canopies, great, but it's got to be in a side or a rear yard. The next section relates to accessibility. Developments with 3 or more electric vehicle charging stations shall provide at least one barrier-free space. Additional barrier-free spaces, would be according to the table, so we can be more specific about that, not to just send them to the table, to your point, Mike. But that's the table that just requires from 1 to 25 spaces, you have 1 ADA accessible space, from 25 to 50, you have 2. So requiring 1 for the first 3, and after that, you are subject to the same ADA requirements like any other apartment. And then the next thing around accessibility is just being sure the charging station infrastructure doesn't negatively impact existing pedestrian spaces. So we still have adequate, 5-foot sidewalks, and we need to have the ability to get inside entrances from parking lots, inside buildings, or down the sidewalk street. Lighting. This lighting section, to Mike's point, is a little redundant. But just ensuring that any lighting is consistent with our existing lighting standards in the ordinance. Signage and notifications, so requiring signs to state the voltage and giving information about the connection to the electric vehicle, and then limiting them to not exceed 3 square feet. And that's the same one that we have for like directional signs or informational signs today for any kind of sign development. And then lastly, for installation and maintenance, ensuring that all necessary building electrical permits are maintained or obtained, ensuring that the stations are maintained, includes a functioning as well as having a phone number or other contact information for the party responsible for operating the facility. And then if for any reason the facility or a charging station is out of operation for more than 90 days, it shall be removed at the cost of the property. And so again, avoiding this, if we're wrong about this, or if, so many cars charge themselves and they drive down the road, we don't need all these stations anymore, we're buying those stations to remove so they don't become blight.
All right, any more questions or discussion on that? All right, so I'm gonna
Open the
Okay, now. All right, so an open public hearing. All right, close public hearing. Any more discussion, questions?
So Mr. Ball, with these changes that we discussed today, is it appropriate to send this to the city commission as a recommendation for approval at this point?
I have two changes from you all. To get rid of item C, do what we talked about in B number 1, and to make the change we just discussed to note in item C5 to just say including screening to make that.
All right.
So those are certainly changes that we can make and ensure that we do it correctly so your recommendation goes to city council as city commission, sorry.
All right. Motion? Discussion? Commissioner
Any more discussion? I'll make a motion. I'll make a motion to recommend approval of the proposed text amendment related to the EV charging station that presented to the city commission because it meets all the standards in section 7-06. Do I have to say it with the edits?
You want to say as amended?
As amended, that's what I was looking for. As amended.
Thank you. Support?
So I will second, but kind of against my better nature because I am the employee of the city commission.
Thank you. Any discussion? Any more discussion? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Motion carried. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
All right, there are no site plans to review. Other business, October meeting date. Is that anything to report or just as?
So there's a community event that often happens that is going on the same date as our October meeting, the Taste of Lapeer for Wakata. So we wanted to talk about who's planning to attend and if we need to look at an alternative meeting date or if we will be okay for that meeting the second week of October.
I guess let's, Commissioner, you're gonna be here. All right, Commissioner Patterson, are you okay?
Should be no problem. Be here.
Commissioner Roberts?
I will be here whether my wife tells me I have to go somewhere.
Okay, all right.
I'm standing tall.
Commissioner Martha?
There's a good chance I will not be here, and I'm pretty sure that Commissioner Bowser.
Catherine's also.
Okay, I was gonna say, we usually typically attend that as well, so, that was a meeting I probably won't be here as well. So we've got you out, Commissioner Bostic, Commissioner Womack.
I'm not there, where will I be there?
What if we moved our meeting time up that day?
It's from 5:30 to 8:30 that event.
Yeah, I'm happy to meet at noon that day.
Yeah.
Right now on the agenda for that day, we have a site plan review for Security Federal, same site plan that's coming back again. And a rezoning request on M24 that should be very straightforward.
So you're saying half an hour?
No promises.
So it's 2 hours.
Yeah.
We can keep that agenda light. We can keep, those are the only two things that are on the agenda. We've passed our
Currently,
submittal.
we still have time for something.
We still have time.
I'm still thinking that's gonna be a challenge.
3 o'clock.
Yeah, I was gonna say during the workday, that's gonna be hard for me to do. But anyone could get here, would have to be 4:30, right?
I don't know, do you have to be there at 5:30 for that event, or can you roll in at 6? That should be late.
No, we should really be there.
It's a pretty important event.
All right.
Well, who's there? It's not.
So I say probably the best bet to get, would be to reschedule. Are
We do
you
it
thinking we should
On a Wednesday
reschedule?
or something
Obviously?
instead?
And the next week is problematic because at least Madam Mayor and I are
We will go.
going to be at the conference. Mr. Desmond, are you going to be at that conference?
I am.
so 26th. Yep.
Four of us for that Monday. Not speaking for Ann or.
And Commissioner Boston, and so anyone else that comes back, 4 of us are out, so 1, 2, 3, 4. I guess if Ann was here, we'd have a,
Yeah,
Yeah,
and,
before.
yeah, I don't think she normally goes, and Shane,
I guess,
I don't think so. And I don't think Marty goes.
oh, true. So should, I guess maybe should we see, check with the other commissioners, because if they're here, based on who's here, we have a quorum.
I kind of need to know, because we got notification deadlines. I
Did Marty say something with email too?
Who's that?
Like Marty might not be here next week?
I think he meant this meeting.
Madam Mayor, I certainly could attend planning commission meetings instead of Wakata.
You should. You should.
Well, I mean, I can go to the Wakata, but, this is important business too, so I can go to it.
Well,
Alright, so
if we
leave it.
were to move it up, he can do both, and if he were a little bit.
Did you say you can't move it up, Jason?
We can move it up.
Oh, I thought you couldn't go to the 5th.
Oh, I thought you meant move it up by
Oh,
the,
at the time, I think.
Oh, sorry.
the 5th I cannot do, we have our Michigan Association of Planning Conference is the first week of October. As my thought was
Can
just
we
if we just-
switch a day? Can we go to a Wednesday or something?
Not me.
Okay.
Not to say that,
Yeah, Wednesdays.
I don't think I've missed a meeting. I picked birthday.
Oh, you
that
got
day.
you need to break that record.
It's like
So
7
I-
years running, 8 years
Yeah.
running.
You called me.
I'm counting 6.
I would say it
And-
sounds like we have a quorum.
And Jeff, Austin, Mike, Doug, Marty. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
So even if one of those was missing.
We have to have
still have a
5.
quorum. Yeah,
So we're good.
I think we could leave a meeting.
So leave it.
And if, obviously, if something changes and you get notice, we'll have to reschedule it anyways, correct? Okay, let's do that. All right, development report is that as presented as
As
attached.
business.
Thank you. Training report, anything new?
Everybody has it.
Yeah.
Please take a look at it. Let me know if we got anything wrong. In the training strategy we adopted in 2022, we removed the requirement that commissioners attend a certain number of trainings. The requirement is that they're offered. So we're meeting that standard in terms of making them available. But if there's anything we missed on there or your information's not right, mark it up and hand it to Kim or I afterwards. And we'll get it.
I was just gonna comment, Mr. Commissioner Womack did put on the meeting, does that count towards one?
Oh, did I not? He should get a one.
He's a big old
It
zero.
should say master planner right there.
I didn't want to. All right, Commissioner comments, Commissioner Pattison, Commissioner Kelly,
Nothing tonight?
Commissioner Roberts,
Nothing?
Commissioner Markler,
I'm good.
Commissioner Womack.
I have a certificate in my office that says master citizen planner.
Okay, so,
Plus, I attend about 15 conferences a year, and there's always a planning component, so I apologize if my mistake.
well, thank you, Master.
I do keep up with it.
Nothing for me tonight, so.
I have just one thing really quickly before you gavel the meeting. We didn't do a great job in transition with Caitlin. Lauren is moving to Chicago. It's not her fault. She graduated from Michigan State. Everybody went to Michigan State, went to Chicago.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you, it's my pleasure being able to work with you all.
I was there last weekend.
Yeah, well, thank you for
Well,
your time.
we're getting you ready for the big city life.
Yeah.
Wow, that's exciting, that's a big move.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Thank you.
A step down.
All right, well, good luck to you.
Thank you.
With that, meeting adjourned.
Is it Lapeer why we can't keep playing?
I think it might be me. I'm not sure.
No.
Definitely not me.
Hey, Austin, it would be because of us.
Well, that's what I was saying, yeah.
All right.
Oh, we'll leave it at 12.
But that's what we have to meet.
Hey, who owns that property right there?
Also, I apologize for my dog.
You mean the one that also?
Is there barking this whole meeting?
Yeah, so it was
I only heard that
Transfer over,
once,
but
at
I
the
hear it.
very beginning. It wasn't a bark, it was like,
So you haven't shown us the dog
So the
now.
dog-
So there's the dog in the building.
And he will see y'all later.
Hey, jump in here.
Gonna build, build.
He's very mad.
It's-
Yeah, sure.